Hello folks, a few days ago I uploaded a video just talking about the fact that things have been heating up lately over at Square Enix in Japan with various developments and projects underway there that we have not yet had announced to us, so we can't really know for sure what they are. But of course there has been speculation about Final Fantasy XVI because we haven't heard anything about a brand new Final Fantasy game since Final Fantasy XV, and with a new generation of consoles no doubt coming out in the next couple of years, it makes perfect sense that the Final Fantasy franchise will be continuing on with those consoles. Yes, we have the Final Fantasy VII remake, but in many ways that's more of a spin-off of the franchise because it's a remake of a game that's already been released, as opposed to actually propelling the franchise forward with a brand new game. Now, some of you criticised the last video I made on whether the game that's being produced by the team behind Final Fantasy XV, or at least the DLC of Final Fantasy XV, is in fact going to be the 16th entry in the franchise. And the reason for that is whatever they're working on, hasn't been announced of course, has been said to be a new IP. And of course everybody responds with, well, if it's a new IP, how can it be a Final Fantasy game? But just to clarify, historically Square have actually described unannounced Final Fantasy games as new IP, and the reason for that is each Final Fantasy game does exist in its own universe, with its own cast of characters, its own story, its own setting, and each Final Fantasy game has been known to become a brand in and of itself. We've seen what Square have done with Final Fantasy XV. It pretty much became its own brand. There was other titles available as part of the compilation, animes, TV series, miniseries, movies, and we had all the expansions and DLC, of course. It became very much its own thing. And so when they talk about new IP, they could very well be referring to Final Fantasy XVI and are considering it to be this self-contained brand, this enterprise that will contain numerous pieces of content, as they have shown us previously. They have talked about games as being a service as opposed to just an individual experience. That said, I understand why some of you weren't satisfied with that particular unannounced project being Final Fantasy XVI, but fear not, because it's not the only thing that Square are developing right now. And we're now getting some news from Business Division 5. This is the business division headed up by Naoki Yoshida. They are, and I probably pronounced the person's name completely wrong there, but they are ramping up development on their unannounced project quite substantially right now. And not only that, but on their website there's a tiny bit of information that tells us basically that the project that this studio is working on is going to be the next main project following Final Fantasy XIV, and it's going to be a large-scale game for the next generation of consoles, which are currently rumoured to be releasing in 2020. And as I mentioned, they are now mass hiring for this particular project. They're really focusing on it. This is not the project that the team that's working on the unannounced project that previously worked on the Final Fantasy XV DLC are working on. This is something different. Now, in my mind, this can only be one of two things. Either another MMO as a successor to Final Fantasy XIV. I don't think it's going to be that. I'll explain why in a moment. Or Final Fantasy XVI. The fact that they've said it's following up their previous Final Fantasy XIV experience makes it sound almost certainly like it is definitely going to be a Final Fantasy game. I don't understand why Square wouldn't develop Final Fantasy XVI in favour of something completely different. I understand having new IPs as well, but not to the expense or to the cost of your current franchise that's worth billions by this point. Now, the reason I don't think that it's going to be an MMO, this particular project, is Final Fantasy XIV is still going strong, and it's still a subscription-based MMO. They're not particularly going to want to compete with that, with themselves. A lot of people for many, many years have been wondering when we're going to get World of Warcraft 2, but why would we get that? World of Warcraft is still immensely popular to this day, and we've seen after however old that game is now, 15 years old I think, that Blizzard are just not having any interest whatsoever to develop a successor to their game, because they don't want to compete with their own successful game. And Final Fantasy XIV, although it had a bumpy beginning, it relaunched into something quite special, and it has a lot of fans even to this day, a lot of people playing it. Obviously it's not as successful as WoW. I don't think any MMO is ever going to be, but it is successful, and I can't imagine Square really trying to both compete with WoW, which is still the dominant force in the market of MMOs, and also with themselves. And not only that, but Yoshida himself, who's heading up this department, has previously stated, not talking about this particular project, but just more generally, but he has stated that he doesn't feel there should be another MMO because Final Fantasy XIV is still going strong. But it's very possible that whatever the unannounced project is, and my money is on Final Fantasy XVI, I want to make that clear, it's very likely going to have some online elements. We saw some online elements in Final Fantasy XV, nothing too major. That was still very much a single player game, of course, but it did have some online elements. I suspect that Final Fantasy XVI is going to have even greater online elements, but not actually pushing it into the MMO category. It's still going to be a Final Fantasy single player game at heart. Now, some people have been excited by the fact that this mini announcement, I guess, by Square, telling us that this new project is definitely underway. They haven't told us what it is. It's Final Fantasy XVI, I'm telling you. But this new project has been released with some concept art, which definitely looks Final Fantasy in its style. And so, obviously, that's been getting people wondering about what it could be. But I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, I'll leave a link to it in the video description. In fact, I'll just put it on the screen about now. I'm pretty sure that's actually taken from Final Fantasy XIV, maybe from one of the expansions or something. So it's going to just be more of a placeholder than anything else right now. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's what that concept art actually is. Now, I guess the obvious next question is, when can we actually start hearing more official information about this project, if indeed it is Final Fantasy XVI? Well, if the rumours are true and the next gen is going to be kicking us off next year, 2020, we'll no doubt be hearing the announcements of that later towards the end of this year from Sony and Microsoft. And it would probably make sense to me that Square Enix would want to be a big part of that announcement. And I, first of all, expect to hear some more news on Final Fantasy VII, the remake, which is undoubtedly going to be taking part on that next generation as opposed to the PlayStation 4, which is where it was initially announced for. So I expect to hear news on Final Fantasy VII for the next gen later this year. And I do think Square Enix will want to be going all in for the next gen, by the sounds of it, with all these projects they've got in development. So my guess, and it is a guess, of course you could say an educated guess, but still a guess, is that we will be hearing Final Fantasy XVI being announced officially before the end of this year. That said, maybe it's not something they're planning on bringing out immediately with the next gen, or within a few months of the next gen. Maybe they'll be bringing it out a year later or 18 months later, in which case we might not hear about it until next year. But I suspect it's going to be towards the end of this year, around the same time as when we get the next gen announced also. But please do stay tuned, subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't already, and have a fantastic day.